Jason Doctor just published an article about Iceland's settlement era on the Icelandic Roots blog. Jason, you draw a lot of information from Landnámabók. Why is that work so important in telling the Icelandic settlement story?
There were really two books that are relevant here. One is Icelandingabók, which is a short historical work covering the early history of Iceland. It was written by Ari Thorgilsson, who was born around 1067 AD. He's also called Ari Fróði, which means Ari the Learned. And that book describes the settlement of Iceland, the formation of the legal system imported from Norway, the calendar, partition of Iceland into quarters, conversion of Icelandic people to Christianity, and some history of the bishops and the law speakers. And the second book, Landnámabók, and that book is a much larger undertaking. We don't really know why it was written, but it covers all the original settlers. Of course, many people were left out. Makes an attempt to really go around the island and cover all the settlers and who they were, where they lived, and what land and farms they owned. And we don't know quite why it was written. It could have been just to chronicle historical events. It might be related to the tithe of 1097 AD, because at that point, landowners had a role in the administration of the church. And so whoever owned the land had to collect tithes for the church and got part of that money back. It could have been just documenting their ancestral claims. It involved Ari Fróði, who I mentioned earlier, and also other people that he consulted with, including a separate person who wrote the stories of the first settlers in East Iceland. So it covers everything in terms of the island. It does leave out a lot of people, particularly women and slaves. It's a really interesting and thorough document nonetheless.
Your article also highlights the contributions of modern archaeology in adding new details. Were there any surprises in what was discovered?
Yeah, I think there were some surprises in what was discovered and what was not discovered. So it was thought that prior to the Norse coming to Iceland, that there were Irish monks from Ireland living there. And in fact, Landnámabók talks about that, and Icelandingabók. Unfortunately, though, we've never found evidence of that, archaeological evidence. Some of the places that old stories suggest the Irish monks lived have not turned up to have any evidence of Irish settlement. In fact, what's turned up is evidence of the Norse settlement. This isn't to say that people from Ireland didn't come to Iceland, but there does not appear to be, at least at this point, evidence of a separate Irish settlement. Also, what's interesting about what we did find out is that if you read Landnámabók, it talks about how people just marched on over to Iceland, took all this land, and then parceled it out until the whole island was taken after not very much time, maybe 60 years or so. What we know from archaeology is that's actually not probably true, that most people lived along the coasts. Much of the inland of the island was wooded, and it was difficult to clear the fields to farm. That took a much longer time than we thought. And so some of the land holdings were actually mostly coastal, and there was a lot of wild land in the middle of the island at the settlement time. In addition to archaeology, genetics is adding another layer to this story. So one hypothesis is that Vikings from Norway went to Scotland and Ireland, intermarried, and or took slaves and brought them to Iceland. And that has actually borne out in the genetic data. Not only does it appear that Icelanders have a mix of DNA that is Celtic and Nordic, but also there are certain types of DNA that pass along through the father and other types that pass along through the mother. And it appears that most of the early settlers were Scandinavian, who were male, whereas a majority of the settlers who were female were not Scandinavian, but were Celtic. So that gives you another sense of how we can triangulate information about genetics and relate it back to Landnámabók and archaeology to better understand the settlement.